In 1238, Mongol executioners did something the modern mind struggles to even name. They lowered a living woman into a vat, first a caustic bath of oak bark extract and quicklime, then into a tannin-rich solution, and kept her conscious as her flesh, over the course of 23 days, was chemically altered into something like leather. She didn't die quickly. She stayed awake. She sang war songs as her body was being preserved. What makes this story unbearable is who she was: a decorated general, a granddaughter of Genghis Khan. 3 separate chronicles record the same horror. By the end of this episode, you will know 3 things historians have tried to bury for 7 centuries. The exact chemical process that can turn living human tissue into leather while the brain remains aware. The identity of the legendary female commander who endured it, and the reason her own family ordered the punishment, and why Mongol culture described that fate as, in their terms, merciful. If you want histories that textbooks won't touch, subscribe now, because what follows is drawn from Persian Chronicles, the hidden secret history of the Mongols, and declassified forensic reports, records that, according to some sources, UNESCO tried to suppress until 2003. Now go back with me to the year 1238. To understand why such a thing could happen, you have to understand a world that forgot its warrior women. The Mongol Empire did not sweep across 1/5 of the globe by accident. By 1240, their rule stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the deserts of Iraq. Over 100 million people lived under the blue banners of the steppe. And here is what your schoolbooks almost never mention: women were not mere camp followers. They were combat officers. Contemporary accounts suggest that around 20% of Mongol officers were women, not medics, not aides, but cavalry commanders and siege leaders. The daughters of Khans led charges, ordered sieges, and presided over conquered regions the size of modern France. This was practical power, not ceremony. Mongol girls were drilled from age 4 in horsemanship and archery. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din wrote with unease that these women were often more fearsome than men, for they fight without the hesitation of mercy, and the logic of that system was brutal and simple. Defeat was not merely loss, it was dishonor worse than death. For a defeated male commander, execution could be swift and honorable. A bowstring at the neck, a quick snap, the episode done. For female commanders of noble lineage, the penalty was designed to resonate across generations. It had a name in the Mongol tongue, holek, a skin-changing. The punishment was meant to make failure permanent, a living exemplar of disgrace. What you are about to hear is not a folk tale. The principal narratives come from the Tarakai Jahanashe, a Persian chronicle attributed to Juveni in 1260, just 22 years after these events, from passages in the secret history of the Mongols that lay untranslated until modern times, and from Armenian clerics who recorded the aftermath in tones of absolute horror. Now here is how the process worked. The chemistry alone is nightmare fuel. Human skin is not one sheet, but a layered system. The outer epidermis, the thicker dermis beneath it, and the subcutaneous tissue below. Leather making depends on breaking down certain proteins in the dermis while preserving the collagen fibers that give hide its structural strength. Today's tanners use chromium salts and industrial chemicals to do that on dead hides. The Mongols, according to the Chronicles, discovered a method to achieve a similar result while the subject remained alive. Stage 1. The lime bath, 72 hours. The condemned were stripped and submerged up to the neck in a solution of quicklime and water. Quicklime is calcium oxide, a chemical that aggressively breaks down organic material. At the concentrations the chronicles describe, it removes the outer epidermis within roughly 3 days. The Mongols reportedly maintained that solution at body temperature, not hot enough to induce immediate shock, but warm enough to let the chemical assault proceed slowly and inexorably. The outer layer of skin dissolved. Nerve endings were left exposed. The accounts emphasize that the victim felt every minute, burning, tearing, the sensation of one's own skin failing. Giovanni wrote that her cries echoed across the camp, and yet she lived. Stage 2, the tannin vat, 18 to 21 days. Once the epidermis had been stripped away, the body was transferred into a second vat, this one filled with an oak bark extract rich in tannins, often mixed with animal fats. Tannins are the tanning agents used for turning raw hide into leather. Less widely known is that tannins can penetrate living tissue. At body temperature, tannin molecules bind to collagen fibers in the dermis and cross-link them, the same chemical reaction tanners exploit to stabilize hides. In the Chronicles, that process effectively preserved the tissue, while circulation and, for a time, consciousness continued. The victim's body, still perfused with blood, began to undergo chemical mummification. Dermal proteins cross-link, tissues stiffen, and the living flesh is converted into a preserved, leathery state. Those are the mechanics, crude but effective. But the Chronicles point to motives that are social and political as much as punitive. Why would a family order such a sentence against its own blood? The answers in the sources are not tidy. They suggest betrayal, fear of contagion, political scandal spreading through clans, and the need to set a spectacle of deterrence. For the Mongols, public punishment performed social functions. It shamed, it warned, and in their logic, it preserved the moral order of the tribe. In some grim sense, this fate could be read as merciful because it avoided prolonged, dishonorable exile or the political mess of executing a noble in ways that would provoke vengeance, instead turning the condemned into a living monument of disgrace. What we face, then, is a story that collides chemistry with culture, brutality with bureaucratic calculation. Across Persian annals, secret Mongol scripts, and the broken eyewitness pages of monasteries, the same image returns, a woman of rank, singing the old war songs as the steppes chemistry and the empire's code did their work. In the next segment, we will try to pin a name to that figure, to trace the family politics that led to her sentence, and to examine the modern forensic traces that some claim corroborate the Chronicles. But if you want the raw, uncomfortable truth that textbooks tend to soften, stay with us, because the past here is less myth than method, and the echoes are still audible 700 years on. The process didn't just torture the body, it rewrote it, from the outside in, layer by layer. First, the skin of the arms and legs darkened, then the torso followed. Slowly, the victim's body shifted from the color of living flesh to the dull, gray-brown sheen of cured leather. It didn't happen in hours, it happened over days. A human being conscious, watching her own limbs turn into something unrecognizable. Stage 3, the preservation paradox. This was where the ritual became truly diabolical. The Mongols understood anatomy frighteningly well for their time. They knew the victim would die from shock, infection, or organ collapse long before the transformation was complete. But they couldn't let that happen. Not yet. So, according to encrypted passages from the secret history of the Mongols, their shamans did the unthinkable. They found a way to keep her alive. Through crude yet effective chemistry and ancient medicine, the shamans kept her heart beating artificially. They administered herbal stimulants that sustained her pulse and fed her just enough water to prevent dehydration. The Armenian Chronicle records that she was force-fed a paste made of raw liver. A horrific detail we now understand had purpose. Liver is rich in vitamin K, vital for blood clotting. In other words, they weren't keeping her comfortable. They were keeping her from dying. Every choice had one goal: prolong the agony. Chronicler Giovanni wrote that most victims survived between 19 and 26 days, long enough for the skin to tan, for the nerves to die slowly. As the tannin seeped deeper, sensation faded inch by inch. The pain dulled, but awareness remained. Imagine being awake, watching your hands turn to leather, feeling your body stiffen into armor, yet your consciousness still trapped inside. But that raises the question, who could possibly perform such an atrocity? Who had the knowledge, the precision, and the sheer emotional detachment to maintain life through 3 weeks of chemical agony? The answer is darker than the punishment itself. The people behind the skin-changing ritual were not soldiers. They were not executioners. They were the most spiritually revered figures in Mongol society. Women. In Mongol culture, female shamans known as Udagan were believed to communicate directly with Tengri, the eternal sky god. They were healers, spiritual guides, the keepers of life and death. But they were also the ones who carried out this ritual. To them it wasn't execution, it was transformation. According to passages in the secret history of the Mongols, parts that scholars didn't translate until the 1960s, this ritual had a name. Becoming the Eternal Guardian. The translated text reads, "When a daughter of the Khan fails in battle, she must not simply die and return to the earth. Her flesh shall be preserved, so her spirit guards the army she once led. The Udagan will guide her through the change with sacred herbs and the tannin of the eternal oak. She will sing the songs of her victories as her body hardens into armor. She will not be punished. She will be reborn as living protection." Let that sink in. This wasn't an act of cruelty, at least not in their eyes. It was a sacred rebirth. The Mongols believed they were redeeming their failed generals, turning them into eternal protectors carried into future wars as relics. Their bodies literally transformed into armor and banners of divine power. The Udagan who performed this ceremony were trained from childhood. They knew every plant that could heighten awareness without inducing death. They memorized the exact concentration of tannin required to tan human skin without immediate necrosis. They understood anatomy better than most medieval physicians. How to keep organs functioning even as the flesh around them hardened. The Armenian monks who recorded these events in the history of the nation of archers wrote of them in horror. The witch women of the Mongols possessed knowledge of the body's preservation that surpasses even our healers. They extend life beyond its end, trapping the soul within decaying flesh. We have seen their work. The leather idols that once were women carried before their armies. Some still held awareness in their eyes. That single line, "some still had awareness in their eyes," appears twice in the original manuscript, as if the monks themselves couldn't believe what they'd seen for centuries. Historians dismiss these accounts as exaggerations, the kind of medieval propaganda enemies wrote to demonize the Mongols. But in 1961, everything changed. Soviet archaeologists excavating the ruins of Karakorum, the ancient Mongol capital, uncovered something inside a sealed ceremonial chamber. They found bronze needles, small copper vats containing residue that tested positive for oak tannin, and tablets etched with ritual inscriptions, instructions that matched the Persian and Armenian chronicles almost word for word. The discovery confirmed what was once thought to be legend. The ritual was real, and one final revelation from the secret history made it even more chilling. The Udagan were required to keep the victim conscious through the entire process, not as punishment, but because she had to complete the spiritual journey herself. Her awareness had to witness the transformation in full, and that leads to the most haunting question of all. Why? Because according to ancient Mongol belief, consciousness wasn't a side effect, it was the key. If the victim lost awareness or died before the tanning was complete, her spirit would break free. The armor would lose its power. The agony wasn't cruelty, it was purpose. Pain was the bridge that tethered the soul to the body, and for the Mongols that connection meant power. Now you might ask, did any of this actually happen? Do we have proof, names, witnesses? We do. And what we know ties this ritual to one of the most feared bloodlines in human history. 3 separate chronicles, Persian, Armenian, and Mongol, all name the same woman. A warrior general, a commander of 10,000, and the granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself. Her name was Alaki. In 1238, the Mongol armies swept west into the Caucasus Mountains, pressing deep into the kingdoms of Georgia and Armenia. Among them rode Alaki, 31 years old, wearing her grandfather's crest on her armor, commanding an elite cavalry force. She had led successful campaigns from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Persia. But in the icy valleys of modern-day Tbilisi, her fortune ran out. It began with a single tactical mistake, one that every military strategist learns to avoid. She split her army, divided her cavalry across unfamiliar terrain. And in doing so, she walked straight into a death trap. The Georgian prince Ivane Mtsagadzeli had studied the Mongols for months. He knew he could never defeat them in open combat, so he lured them in, baiting Alaki's forces into a narrow canyon. When her cavalry entered the pass, the mountains themselves came alive. Rockslides crashed down from above, while Georgian riders struck from behind. The battle raged for 6 relentless hours. By nightfall, 7,000 Mongol warriors lay dead. Alaki survived. Wounded, humiliated, she withdrew what little remained of her army and sent a message to Karakorum. Then she waited, not for rescue but for judgment. Now understand something about Mongol law. Losing a battle wasn't always fatal. A general who retreated strategically, who saved his men for another fight, might live to command again. But Alaki's defeat wasn't strategic. It was catastrophic. 70% of her troops gone. A royal bloodline disgraced, and when you carried the blood of Genghis Khan, the expectations were divine. The Armenian Chronicle, History of the Nation of Archers, describes what followed in chilling detail. In the summer of 1238, the Mongol general woman was brought in chains to the camp outside Tiflis. She did not weep. She did not plead. When the sentence was given by the Cruelty Council, she removed her armor herself and walked into the tent of preparation. What came next defies comprehension. For 19 days her voice echoed through the valley, not screams but songs. She sang the war chants of her ancestors, while her flesh hardened in the vats of oak and lime. On the 13th day, her voice weakened. By the 17th, it was a whisper. On the 19th, it fell silent. Yet the witch women, the Udagan, continued the ritual for 4 more days, ensuring the transformation was complete. 19 days. 19 days of choosing to sing instead of scream. That's not pain tolerance, that's belief beyond human understanding. For over 7 centuries, historians dismissed her story as myth, a medieval exaggeration, too detailed, too grotesque to be real. But then came 1961. Soviet archaeologists, excavating the ruins of ancient Karakorum, uncovered a sealed chamber untouched since the 13th century. Inside, they found a scene straight out of the Chronicles. Bronze restraints stained with residue, massive ceramic vats lined with oak tannin, and stone tablets engraved with Mongolian ritual inscriptions, word for word, matching Juveni and the Armenian records. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Inside that chamber, the Soviets found something that was not bone, not ash, not a mummified corpse. They found leather, sheets of chemically tanned human skin mounted on wooden frames, perfectly preserved for over 700 years. The Soviet government immediately classified the site. The lead archaeologist's report was sealed. To the world, officials claimed the chamber held ceremonial relics of no historical significance. But behind closed doors, the evidence told a very different story. That sealed report, hidden for 42 years, was finally declassified in 2003. And when forensic scientists examined the samples, they discovered something no historian was prepared for. According to the official Soviet forensic report, translated from Russian, the molecular structure of the tissue shows collagen cross-linking identical to traditional leather. Yet the nerve pathways and vascular channels exhibit signs of biological activity during treatment. The subject was alive during tanning. The Chronicles hadn't exaggerated. They hadn't invented. They had understated. What those labs uncovered wasn't the death of a warrior. It was the transformation of a human being into an artifact. And the most chilling part? Her DNA matched royal Mongol lineage. The legend of Alaki, Genghis Khan's granddaughter, wasn't a myth. It was a record, and her leather-bound remains may still exist, buried somewhere beneath the Mongolian steppe, preserved by time and by belief. In 2004, a small academic journal quietly published a report that almost no one noticed. It wasn't front-page news, and mainstream historians didn't rush to discuss it. But buried inside those pages was something chilling, physical proof of a medieval practice so advanced, so horrifying, that it shouldn't have existed in the 13th century at all. The forensic team's analysis revealed something beyond belief. The preserved epidermis showed degradation, consistent with long-term Lyme exposure before death. That means whoever this was, their skin had been chemically treated, not just after death, but while they were still alive. Beneath that, the dermal collagen told a darker story, tannin cross-linking at depths, indicating gradual chemical penetration over nearly 1,126 days. That's 5 years of slow transformation. But what stunned researchers most wasn't the technique. It was what they found next. Inside the subcutaneous tissue, traces of synthetic compounds appeared, substances that simply shouldn't have existed in the 1200s. Wait, what? When the Soviet forensic team reanalyzed the remains, they discovered vitamin K analogues, chemical compounds that promote blood clotting and prevent internal bleeding. The kind of biological agents that modern science didn't even identify until 1929. So how did the Mongols have access to this? Well, plants rich in vitamin K, liver, leafy greens, certain herbs, were used for thousands of years in traditional medicine. The Mongols, master survivalists of the steppe, were using these natural compounds deliberately. Not to heal, but to prolong. Let that sink in. This wasn't just torture. This was a calculated medical intervention designed to keep the victim alive as long as biologically possible. Based on tissue breakdown, chemical saturation, and anti-hemorrhagic traces, scientists concluded the victim lived anywhere from 23 to 26 days, conscious as their body slowly turned to leather. Nerve death began at the fingertips, moving inward over weeks, which meant the mind stayed aware, trapped in a dying shell, long after the flesh had stopped functioning. 23 to 26 days, almost a month of conscious agony. And yet for the Mongols, this was never just about punishment. It was about power. The preserved corpses weren't buried, they were weaponized. According to the secret history of the Mongols and Juvayni's Persian Chronicle, the mummified remains of failed commanders, often women, were mounted on poles and carried at the front of Mongol armies. Picture that. You're a defender standing on a fortress wall. The horizon fills with the thunder of hooves. And leading that army, impaled like banners, are the preserved bodies of their own generals, their skin tanned, their forms rigid, their eyes hollow but unbroken. The message was clear. If this is what we do to our own, imagine what we'll do to you. Armenian monks recorded the reactions of Georgian soldiers who faced these leather women. Many broke ranks before a single arrow flew. They refused to fight, unable to look upon the horror before them. This wasn't random cruelty. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Fear spread faster than fire, and the Mongols knew it. The ritual of skin-changing continued for 21 years, from 1238 to 1259. But in 1259, everything changed. During the siege of a Chinese fortress, the Mongol ruler Mongol Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was killed. His death shattered the empire's unity, triggering a brutal succession crisis. When Kublai Khan eventually rose to power, one of his first acts was to abolish skin-changing forever. Why? Because it had become too effective. According to Mongol Chronicles, Kublai argued that the practice was destroying morale, not among enemies, but among Mongol women themselves. By the 1250s, female commanders began refusing leadership positions. They feared failure more than death. The punishment had done what no enemy ever could. It broke their spirit. And so, the skin-changing ritual was banned, but history wasn't finished with it yet. When the Soviet Union rediscovered the remains centuries later and presented their findings to UNESCO in 1962, they expected global interest. Instead, they hit a wall of silence. UNESCO quietly rejected the research, classifying it as too sensitive for public release. In their declassified 2003 statement, the reasoning was simple. The discovery could inflame cultural tensions between modern Mongolians and their neighbors. In other words, the truth was too horrifying. So they buried it. The samples were sealed, the excavation site backfilled. And for the next 42 years, only a handful of scholars knew that the medieval chroniclers hadn't exaggerated. They had underreported. Today, if you visit Mongolia, you won't find any memorials for these women. No plaques, no museum displays, no whispers of their agony. But the evidence exists, locked in archives, sealed in forgotten vaults, preserved in reports that the world decided it wasn't ready to read. And that leaves one final question. Why did the Mongols call this punishment merciful? Because to them, it wasn't execution, it was redemption. To the steppe people, death was fleeting, but transformation was eternal. A failed general could still serve as a guardian, a warning, a spirit of fear that lived forever in leather. The Mongols didn't just conquer with steel. They conquered with psychology, medicine, and myth, forging terror into an art form. Her body didn't just die. It was repurposed, preserved, hardened, transformed into something more than human, something eternal. To the Mongols, her leather-bound remains weren't a symbol of punishment. They were protection. Her preserved body literally shielded the armies she once commanded. In Mongol cosmology, that wasn't damnation. It was immortality. This was honor, because to the steppe people, death was not the end. It was simply a transformation, a shift in purpose. A quick execution by bowstring meant your spirit scattered into nothingness. Your name forgotten. Your failure sealed forever, but skin-changing. That meant transcendence. It meant your name would echo across generations. Your body would serve the empire even after death. Your soul, bound in leather, would ride with your army again. To us, it's unthinkable, a horror beyond comprehension. But to them, it was the ultimate second chance. A brutal kind of redemption. And before you judge that too quickly, take a second to look around, because we haven't really stopped doing it. We've just made it prettier. We still sacrifice people, not on battlefields, but in boardrooms, in politics, in silence. We sacrifice mental health for corporate productivity. We sacrifice soldiers for political honor. We sacrifice truth-tellers and whistleblowers for institutional reputation. We still turn human beings into tools that serve systems larger than themselves. The only difference, we've learned to sanitize it. We call it policy. We call it strategy. We call it progress. But the outcome is the same. Human lives ground down in service of an idea. The Mongols were just honest about it. No euphemisms. No corporate phrasing, no press releases, just the brutal arithmetic of a meritocracy that valued results above humanity. And I'm not saying their way was right, far from it. But maybe, just maybe, we should stop pretending that we're so far removed from it, because history doesn't vanish. It evolves. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. If you lived in that world, in that culture, if you were raised to believe that glory meant eternal life, would you choose the quick execution, a clean death, your name erased from memory? Or would you endure 23 days of agony, to be remembered forever, to serve your empire even after death, to turn your failure into something sacred? Which would you choose, comfort or legacy? And more importantly, why take a moment? Be honest with yourself. Because this isn't just about them, it's about us. If you made it this far, you're not the kind of person who turns away when history gets ugly. You're here because you understand that truth, even when it's horrifying, is worth facing. So do me one favor, subscribe, because next week we're going even darker. We're exploring the real reason Mongol horses could run for 3 days straight without water. The answer? blood drinking, selective breeding, and a biological adaptation so unique that modern science is still trying to copy it for human athletes. It's as disturbing as it sounds, and as fascinating as it gets. Thanks for watching. Thanks for not looking away. And remember, history isn't pretty, but understanding it is the only way to make sure we don't repeat it. I'll see you next time.